And now, 25 years ago, the Asian American Writers Workshop, or AAWW, began devoting itself to diversity in publishing by creating, printing, and sharing Asian American literature. The not-for-profit arts organization hosts a New York event series that includes technique workshops, open mic nights, and more. Also at the forefront of expanding cultural publishing is Akashic Books, a Brooklyn-based independent publishing company dedicated to giving voice to authors often overlooked by mainstream media.
Well, before we meet our guests, let's take a look at this chart produced by Lee & Low Books. Now, it's based on a report they did called Diversity in Publishing. Now, this may or may not surprise you, but according to that Lee & Low report, nearly 80% of the publishing industry overall is whites. That's 78% of the industry is also comprised of women, and 88% of the people consider themselves to be straight heterosexuals. And finally, only 8% of literary professionals identified as disabled. So we're looking at a pretty white, pretty female landscape, Greg.
Yes, let's dive into some of those numbers. Here to talk about all that and how their organizations are working to make it more diverse are Ken Chen, the executive director of the AAWW. Ken, thank you very much for being on BK Live.
Thank you for having me. You might have to give your guests magnifying glass so they can see the slivers in that chart.
We'll get into that too.
It was very big on the television. It was very big on the television.
We also want to welcome Ibrahim Ahmed. Ibrahim, thank you very much for being here as well. Ken, Ibrahim, thank you very much, both of you, for being
pleasure.
here.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Ken, let's start with you. Why aren't we hearing about the lack of diversity in publishing the same way we're hearing about it in, say, television and film these days?
I think the reason actually is that no one really cares. I think that we at this table might care, but I think that publishing is actually not a very rationalized industry, but it's a very for-profit industry. And people don't think that diversity will help their bottom line. And the sad thing is that the opposite is true, that if publishers had more books for writers of color, they would create more markets. You know, there's a recent New York Times article that showed that black women bought books more as a demographic group than any other group. And so I think the simple answer is that in other industries that you have to appease your employees, you even have affinity groups, you know, but I don't really think publishing does things like that. I don't know if Ibrahim wants to add anything.
Well, and I think everything that Ken says is correct. There's also this false assumption that there isn't a market out there for literature by people of color. And, you know, we've seen time and again counterexamples, you know, and even looking at, you know, another medium like music, for example. It's obviously a different form, and it's you know, can be consumed more passively than reading a book. But if you look at the cultural landscape of this country right now, people of color are leading the charge in many ways in all sorts of creative pursuits, but yet this has not extended to the literary world and the publishing business. And I think, you know, every publisher has a responsibility to address some of these systemic challenges that we're facing.
So why is it that so many straight, white, non-disabled women are just crushing it with publishing? Like, what is that track to other people? Are they just not aware of the jobs in publishing? Or does every little girl want to grow up to be the editor of whatever magazine her mom subscribes to? How did it become such a women's work?
Well, one thing I want to add about the previous point is that if you can't imagine someone exists, you can't imagine that there's a market for them. Right. And I think that has a lot to do with it. I think that, as Ibrahim can tell you, like, there's a lot of, you basically have to be rich to go into publishing because the publishing industry doesn't pay a living salary. So in order to accept the pay to be an editorial assistant or to be an unpaid intern, you have to go in not being worried about money. And the other thing is that publishing is something where it's built on exclusion. So you have to go to college, your English has to be very good, you have to then get an MFA, then you have to publish things in a journal, then you have to get an agent, and then you have to sell your book. So there's basically like someone kicking you out.
You have to do all that to get a job at Random House?
Well, you have to do all that to publish a book.
Okay.
And to get a job at Random House, you probably have to know someone who's in the industry and know that you have to go to New York. I met this guy who was really good at like getting himself into scenes. He did ketamine in Chinese street gangs. He did the finances for the Dalai Lama, or no, for the Vatican. And but he hung out in Buddhist temples in Tibet. And he said, I haven't been able to break into the literary world.
You could break into the Vatican,
Yeah.
but not the literary world. Interesting. So let's talk a little about the AAWW. How and what are you doing to kind of alleviate these problems with the literary industry?
So this is the 25th anniversary of the Asian American Writers Workshop, and we have a long history. Gino Diaz used to play Super Nintendo in our loft space in the East Village. We have a lot of programs, including fellowships for writers of color, including right now Muslim writers and first-generation immigrant writers who write in Asian language. We also publish online magazines, including a magazine that's all about what it's like to live in low-income communities in New York. So for us, I think it's great if people like us get to the table, like well-educated people of color, but for me it's important if people who can't speak English or who don't have money or who live in Queens or Staten Island or the Bronx or wherever, they also have a seat at the table. And so a lot of the projects we're doing are trying to address issues of like class inequality, Islamophobia, undocumented immigrants. If you think about all of Donald Trump's speeches, you know, what he's saying is that undocumented immigrants will kill you, you know, Muslims are going to bomb the United States. So the whole idea of what it means to be American is built on these sort of things. So we're trying to do a lot to engage with writers who are immigrants without legal status, writers who are coming from so-called West Asia, like Arab writers, Persian writers, you know, and so forth.
So Ibrahim, you work for an imprint that has a decidedly different perspective. Akashic Book has a really diverse portfolio of people, and you guys are successful. So how is it that you're making it? What do you know that the larger publishing world doesn't for some reason?
Well, to that end, you know, we are now entering our 20th year as a completely independent publisher. We don't have any outside investors or backers or financing, so we stay in business solely by the sale of our books, which might sound like an obvious thing to say, but it's actually quite rare in the publishing world to not be somehow subsidized by a larger parent corporation. Our mission since day one, and in fact our tagline, which is slightly tongue-in-cheek, is reverse gentrification of the literary world. And you know what this sort of means in a nutshell is that, you know, literature shouldn't simply be the domain of a well-educated, exclusive elite. And you know, I'll often say that the ideal Akashic author is one who perhaps might not be able to find a home anywhere else. And so these are the types of writers that we have been seeking out and looking for since day one. And you know, though we have had some lean years, you know, in our history, we are a thriving press, and we are thriving specifically because we're publishing books that reflect, firstly, the community that we're in, but also there's such an opportunity for publishers to be, you know, releasing more works by Black American authors, by Latino authors, from, you know, first-generation immigrants, and the list goes on and on and on. There's this misperception that publishers can simply, and I'm talking specifically about the big houses, that they can have, you know, their one or two Black authors to fit a quota. And beyond that, their relationship to publishing the reality of the world that we live in is actually quite narrow and unsatisfying. So we like to think that diversity is something that is lived every day experientially, and it's something that we take back into our personal lives. It's about the relationships that you cultivate, the people you talk to. It's not simply publishing a couple of people of color in a vacuum and thinking that, you know, you've done your job and that's it.
Before we finish up, we know if you happen to be a person of color, you can buy books on Fulton Street, you can get them out of the back of trunks, you can get them at the beauty salon. There is, as you pointed out, a thriving industry that doesn't get recognized by the New York Times. So is that a bad thing? We have like a whole shadow economy of people who are making livings and building empires based off of them circumventing that system that doesn't care that they're not getting that money. So someone's leaving it on the table. Is that a bad thing that publishing is ignoring people of color?
I think that it's good that those other venues exist because it's sort of like the underground club scene for literature or something, you know. And I think that that kind of bohemian, like outside space is where interesting things are happening, which is why we do things at the workshop. And I think it might be bad for big publishers because that is money that they're leaving on the table. But I think the big thing is for you to imagine if you're a big publisher. For you to look at that, you know, guy with the table on the street or selling books out of the back of their car and think, this is actually literature. This is a book I should care about, you know, rather than just sort of screening it out. Yeah. Well, people usually think about racism and diversity as like saying a bad word, but it's about imagining the humanity of the other person and not just you not doing something that sucks, you know, but you being able to care about the other person's ideas and what they do.
So they're telling us we only have a minute left. We want to get your final thoughts, but also please tell us where to reach your organizations, how to find literature from your organizations, all that good stuff, please.
Absolutely. So Akashic Books, you can find us on the web, akashicbooks.com, AKA SHIC Books. We're active on social media. We solicit short fiction submissions that we publish on our website. Please come and check us out and be part of the conversation.
We're the Asian American Writers Workshop. You can go to aaww.org. We do like 3 events a week with like stand-up comedians and activists, professors, even cooking demonstrations. So if you're in New York, swing on by.
Okay, very cool. Thanks for coming by.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you
Thanks
both
so much.
very much
Appreciate
for being
it.
here. Thank you.